What is up, guys? We are back in Ecclesiastes chapter 2 today. Just to kind of reiterate a couple of big things from chapter 1. First one is whenever he says over and over in this book, meaningless, meaningless, a chasing after the wind, it's all meaningless, utterly meaningless. He's not saying that something doesn't have meaning at all. What he's saying is that it is a breath, a vapor, a mist, or a smoke, something that you can see or perceive, but that you can't hold on to. So thinking about this kind of in the world today, the deception would be that we chase, the career, the money, the big house, the nice car, the things, right? Um, that don't actually last, right? You can't hold on to them. These aren't things that we take with us whenever we die, right? We know that other places in Scripture also tells us to keep our minds focused on heavenly things and heavenly places, and to focus on what is eternal, what is unseen, because what is unseen is eternal and what is seen is not. So whenever he says meaningless, he's not saying that it doesn't have meaning. He's saying that it's something that you can't hold on to. And then he also talks about this kind of forever cycle of striving and striving and striving, all basically to be, for naught, so to speak. Um, and then he wraps up the chapter saying, with much wisdom comes much sorrow. The more knowledge, the more grief. So, for us living as believers in the Lord, whenever we study the word, we find conviction for certain things that we are doing or certain things that we're not doing in life. And I think that's part of what he's referencing here. My note down here, right? The more of the truth we know, the more the lies, the more that we see the lies in the world. Whenever we study the truth and when we are intimate with the truth, the lies begin to expose themselves. And whenever the lies begin to expose themselves, we might be convicted of it ourselves that, man, we're doing something that's not aligned with the truth, right? Or we see somebody that we know or love, that's close to us that has bought a lie in exchange for the truth. And that grieves us, or that gives sorrow, that brings sorrow to us, because we don't want that person to live in a lie. We want them to live the truth, right? So jumping in here to chapter 2, he's going to continue, like almost every other book of the Bible. He's going to continue building upon the things that he wrote in chapter 1. So jumping right into chapter 2 now. He says, I thought in my heart, come now, I will test you with pleasure to find out what is good. But that also proved to be meaningless. Laughter, I said, is foolish. And what does pleasure accomplish? I think, man, what a great question here. What does pleasure accomplish? Something that, I think in the world today, we put so much emphasis on is pleasure, right? It's comfortability, it's relaxing, or whatever that may be, right? We were actually just last night at service at church, and one thing that came up was complainers, right? We were talking about complaining, and our director of Sub 30, he said that complaining comes from a place of what was it? How did he say it? It comes from a place of, let me look here. Complaining spawns from entitlement. I thought, wow, um, that's pretty interesting to think about, right? Whenever you're in the midst of something difficult and you're complaining about it, it's because you feel like you deserve something better, right? Um, Along the same lines, I think it's interesting. What does pleasure actually accomplish? I think it's a good question to ponder on. Verse 3, he says, I tried cheering myself with wine and embracing folly, my mind still guiding me with wisdom. Okay. Um, this is something I wanna, dig into real quick, because it'll help make sense as we go through the rest of this. So he says he tried cheering himself with wine and embracing folly. Okay, so uh and then he says, my mind's still guiding me with wisdom. What does it mean whenever he says, my mind's still guiding me with wisdom? So I looked down here, actually a little further down. So biblical wisdom, biblical wisdom begins with reverence for God. Okay. In Proverbs 9:10 tells us that the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom, right? And knowledge of the Holy One is understanding. So the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. So we can't have wisdom without starting with a reverent respect and fear of the Lord. Okay. So uh, coming back up here to verse 3, he says, my mind still guide me with wisdom. So what he's saying here is that although he's going to cheer himself with wine and embrace folly, he's not being mindless in what he's doing, but he's intentionally giving himself to the indulgence in these things while keeping his awareness about him so that because he's trying to like he's giving himself to these things, right? He says, I will test you with pleasure to find out what is good. So he's not just like I don't have anything else going for me in life. I'm just going to give myself to these things mindlessly and just let it all go. He's saying I want to go see what the deal is here. I want to go see what is good. So I'm going to give myself to it, but I'm going to keep my mind about me so that I'm aware of what's happening within my spirit as I'm pursuing this, as I'm giving myself to these things, right? So whenever he says my mind's still guiding me with wisdom, that's, I think, what he's referencing. He says, I wanted to see what was worthwhile for men to do under heaven during the few days of their lives. Right? So again, he's giving himself to these things because he's trying to test to see like what's worthwhile, right? What is worthwhile? So I think that's kind of cool. He says, so then in doing that, he says, in verse 4, he says, I undertook great projects. I built houses for myself, planted vineyards, I made gardens and parks, and planted all kinds of fruit trees in them. I made reservoirs to water groves of flourishing trees. Okay, so he says, so he worked on great projects to see what the deal was there. Then in verse 7, he says, I bought male and female slaves and had other slaves who were born in my house. So he worked on great projects. He brought in slaves. He said, I also owned more herds and flocks than anyone in Jerusalem before me. I amassed silver and gold for myself and the treasure of kings and provinces. I acquired men and women singers and a harem. The note here, note B, it says down here, it's like what does it say? Yeah, the meaning of the Hebrew for this phrase is uncertain, so we don't know exactly what that means whenever he says that. But he says, and a harem as well, the delights of the heart of man. And he says, I became greater by far than anyone in Jerusalem before me. In all this, my wisdom stayed with me. My note here again, just what I reiterate or what I iterated a second ago, was that he kept with him his observational awareness in the midst of all of this. So he's like, okay, I'm gonna embrace, I'm gonna cheer myself with wine, I'm gonna embrace folly. And he says, in doing that, he's like, I did all of these different things. I took on great projects. I brought in slaves. I had huge herds and flocks. I amassed silver and gold and treasures of kings and provinces. I had singers. I became greater than anyone in the world, right? In Jerusalem before me. And he says, but in all this, my wisdom stayed with me. I stayed aware of, I knew that I was doing these things to try to understand what was good for man to do all the days that he's like living and working in the world. So he kept his observational awareness. So then in verses 10 and 11, he really kind of lays it out plain. He says, I denied myself nothing my eyes desired. I refused my heart no pleasure. So he gave himself everything that he wanted. Okay. He says, my heart took delight in all my work, and this was the reward for all my labor. Okay, so I think it's something, and he's gonna kind of say this thing and say the same thing, I think, in a little bit of a different way, a couple verses down. But I think this is a huge deal, right? He says, my heart took delight in all my work. So he enjoyed his work, he enjoyed the work that he did. And this was the reward for all my labor. The reward for his labor was not the thing that he was laboring to produce, but it was the delight that he had in the progress of working, in the process of working. You know, it's like professional athletes always talk about falling in love with the process, falling in love with the training, falling in love with the practice. Whenever you're in that kind of a place, whenever you like love what you do for work, people talk about like from a work perspective, man, if you love what you do for work, you'll never work a day in your life, right? I think that's kind of what he's getting at here in the second part of verse 10. But then I also, you see, where is it later down here? Yeah, so he gets into it here in verse 17. I'm gonna hit on it here a little early, but my thought here was right, like imagine doing a ton of work, right, to stir up the dust, only for it to settle right back to the ground again. Okay, so coming back over here to chapter 1, he talks about all things are wearisome, more than one can say. Wearisome, it comes from the Hebrew word yaga, meaning deep exhaustion that comes from an endless striving. And here in verses 5, 6, 7, and 8, he talks about the sun rises, the sun sets, hurries back to where it rises again. In verse 7, all streams flow into the sea, yet the sea is never full. To the place the streams come from, there they return again. He talks about this endless striving, going back and forth and back and forth and back and forth, and it just never ends, right? I was just thinking about that, like the image of, doing all this work to stir up the dust, and then it all just settles down again, right? Um, and he says, verse 11, yet when I surveyed all that my hands had done and what I had toiled to achieve, everything was meaningless, a chasing after the wind. Nothing was gained under the sun. Right? So again, let me just reiterate. He says, this was the reward for all my work, for all my labor. What was the reward? The delight that he had in his work, right? The delight that he had in his work was his reward. And he says that I surveyed all my hands had done and what I had toiled to achieve, right? So that's like the end outcome of what he had toiled for. If he's taking on great projects, right? He says up here, I built houses for myself. I planted vineyards. I made gardens and parks. I planted all kinds of fruit trees in them. He said, I made reservoirs. He says, all of those things, right? The herds and the flocks, the silver and the gold, all of those things that he had toiled to accumulate or to build, to create, all of those is what he says was meaningless, a chasing after the wind. Nothing was gained under the sun, right? Um, but he did enjoy the delight. He had delight in his work. So, man, really interesting there, right? So, I guess question that I think about is like, what is the goal? What are the things that I'm striving for, that I'm toiling for? And are they eternal? Are they not eternal? Am I putting too much value in those things? Because I think what he's really getting at here, right, is like he says nothing was gained under the sun. Um, what can we gain? What does it mean to gain something if we can't keep it, right? What does it mean to, you know, hit X amount of income per year if if our income or the things that we buy with it, right? Let's say that we amass a bunch of, gold and Bitcoin and a big house and a nice car. We can't take those things with us when we die, right? Which is where he's saying nothing was gained under the sun. It was meaningless, a chasing after the wind. We can perceive it. We can drive around in the car. We can live in the house. We can have parties in the house, and have our friends over and do these things. But we don't take it with us. We can't hold on to it forever. The things that we have are things that the Lord has given us to steward while we're here, right? These aren't things that we keep with us forever. Okay, so moving on down now to verse 12, he says, then I turned my thoughts to consider wisdom and also madness and folly. Okay, so he looked at, right, so he said, I'm going to give myself to kind of working and building on these things. And he says, I kept my wisdom about me, but now he's going to turn his thoughts to consider wisdom, madness, and folly itself. So again, we kind of looked at the wisdom piece earlier, right? Proverbs 9:10 talks about fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. So biblical wisdom begins with a reverence for God. Okay. So then madness, what does madness mean? Madness is an irrational self-indulgence disconnected from reality or from a reality that is distorted. Um, the way that it differentiated itself from folly. So folly is what a fool does, but the fool rejects God. Madness is like I still affirm that the Lord that God is real in some sense, right? But I'm like I'm going against what I know the truth to be, and I'm just going to go give myself to this thing. It's like an addiction or just a reckless lifestyle that is distorted, that is being operated from or with from a distorted perspective where I kind of just say, this is what my flesh wants. I'm just going to go give it here, even though that I know that I'm supposed to be living a different way. So then in Psalm 14:1, looking at folly, folly is again what the fool does, and the fool rejects God. So Psalm 14:1 tells us, says, the fool says in his heart, there is no God. They are corrupt, their deeds are vile. there is no one who does good. So the fool rejects God, says that there is no God. So I wanted to call that out. So he's gonna turn and he's gonna reflect on wisdom, madness, and folly. He says, "What more can the king's successor do than what has already been done? I saw that wisdom is better than folly, just as light is better than darkness. The wise man has eyes in his head while the fool walks in darkness. But I came to realize that the same fate overtakes them both." Okay, I wanted to pause here in the beginning part of verse 14. Um, without the fear of the Lord, right? So the beginning of wisdom, to be a wise man, right, means you have wisdom. The beginning of wisdom is a fear of the Lord, a reverent respect of the Lord, right? And we know that the fool rejects God. So one has a reverent respect and fear of the Lord, the other rejects God. And he says that the wise man has eyes in his head while the fool walks in darkness. My thought here was, right, without the fear of the Lord, we have no vision. We have no vision for life, which is pretty interesting to think about. He says, "But I came to realize that the same fate overtakes them both. Then I thought in my heart, the fate of the fool will overtake me also. What then do I gain by being wise?" He says down here, skipping a little bit, he says, "Like the fool, the wise man too must die." So he says that right up here, he says that the same fate overtakes them both. The fate of the fool will overtake me also. He says, "I said in my heart, this too is meaningless." Verse 16, "For the wise man, like the fool, will not be long remembered. In the days to come, both will be forgotten. Like the fool, the wise man too must die." Um, Interesting. I kind of think here about in the book of Romans how Paul talks about we are called still to obedience. Though we have freedom in Christ, we are still called to obedience, right? And so whenever he's asking this question, what do I gain by being wise? I think what we gain by being wise, we also have to be intentional about recognizing that this book was written before Christ was revealed, right? Um, what do we gain by being wise? Well, to be wise starts with a reverent respect of the Lord. And other parts in the New Testament tell us to live our lives as a holy sacrifice to the Lord, so to speak. We are to die to ourselves so that the Spirit may live within us. It's not the life that we are living, but the life that the Lord is living in us. And so. I don't know, just a couple thoughts there, but it is definitely interesting and true, right? The fool and the wise man both die. Um, okay, so picking up here in verse 17, he says, "So I hated life because the work that is done under the sun was grievous to me." So he hated life because his work was grievous, was tough, it was laborsome, right? He says, "All of this is meaningless, a chasing after the wind." I hated all the things I had toiled for, right? Which we kind of talked about earlier. He says, "I hated all the things I had toiled for under the sun because I must leave them to the one who comes after me," right? So he says he hated life because of the work that he had been doing was grievous, but he also hated the things that he had toiled for because he doesn't get to keep them, right? He says, "And who knows whether the he will be wise, a wise man or a fool, right? The one who comes after him, who is leaving the work that he had, the product of the work that he had done. Who knows whether that person is going to be wise or a fool?" He says, "Yet he will have." He will have control over all the work into which I poured my effort and skill under the sun. This too is meaningless. So my heart began to despair. I was kind of curious about this. I'm like, what does despair mean as like a verb? Let's just tap on it real quick. So as a verb, whenever he says, "So my heart began to despair," he's saying that his heart began to lose hope, to give up hope, to abandon hope, to give up, to lose heart, right? So he says, right, he says, "So my heart began to despair over all my toilsome labor under the sun." So he began to lose hope over his labor. He says, "For a man may do his work with wisdom, knowledge, and skill, and then must leave all he owns to someone who has not worked for it. This too is meaningless and a great misfortune. What does a man get for all the toil and anxious striving with which he labors under the sun?" Again, what a great question. What do you get for all of your toil and anxious striving? He says, all his days, or sorry, all his days, his work is pain and grief. Even at midnight, or sorry, even at night, his mind does not rest. This too is meaningless. What does a man gain for all of his work, for all of his labor? And the work is pain and grief, and even at night his mind doesn't rest because of this work that he's doing. He says this too is meaningless. A man can do nothing better than to eat and drink and find satisfaction in his work. This too I see is from the hand of God, for without him who can eat or find enjoyment? Okay, I think this is a big one here, right? He says a man can do nothing better. You can't do any better than finding satisfaction in your work, right? Which is what he says up here again. He says, where was it? What verse was that? He says, my heart took delight in all my work, and this was the reward for my labor in verse 10. My heart took delight in all my work, and this was the reward for all my labor. So then down here in verse 24, he says, a man can do nothing better than to eat and drink and find satisfaction in his work. And then he says, "This too I see is from the hand of God, for without him who can eat or find enjoyment?" Verse 26, to the man who pleases God, to the man who pleases him, God gives wisdom, knowledge, and happiness. But to the sinner, he gives the task of gathering and storing up wealth to hand it over to the one who pleases God. This too is meaningless, a chasing after the wind. So, man, another interesting chapter. This book is very sobering in a sense, right? And I think specifically like, I'll be 29 this year. Just thinking about young guys who are kind of in early stages of life that are like building for the future, looking at, their careers, thinking about, finding a wife and building a family, all of these things. Like it's so easy to kind of get caught up in chasing what the world values. And I think this book is just really good to make sure that we keep our focus in the right place. Um, and so I think my biggest takeaway so far in chapter two, right, is like we want to focus on the product of our, work and labor and these things. But what he's suggesting here, the teacher, is that we can do no better than to simply enjoy our work and steward the products of those things, right? And to be generous with the products of our labor, because we don't keep those things. They're meaningless, a chasing after the wind, right? They are, I mean, it's a chasing after the wind. I mean, again, I said it in chapter one, like just imagine what it looks like if you pull up and somebody is chasing after the wind. You're like, what's wrong with that guy, right? That's got to be what the Lord looks at us when we get caught up and we are chasing things that we don't keep. The Lord's got to be looking at us like we would look at somebody that's running around, in the street. Imagine somebody running around trying to catch the wind like that. It's like, yeah, it's like you can't do that, bro. You can't do that. And I gotta imagine that's what the Lord looks at us and sees whenever we're chasing these things of the world. And so I just think like, man, how can I find satisfaction in my work? Um, let's just do a good job. There's other scripture, right, that tells us that we should be working as unto the Lord as we are. So, man, like whatever you're doing today, whatever your work looks like, whether you're an employee, you own a company, you like your job, you don't like your job, we can do the best job that we can do because we're not doing it for, necessarily the company or ourselves. We're doing it for the Lord, right? We are a light in the world. We should be doing things as doing them for the Lord. And so, man, let's just find some satisfaction in like doing a good job. And let's take some responsibility and ownership of that. So, great chapter. Looking forward to chapter three, and I'll talk to you guys soon. Peace.